In a stunning decision, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down President Trump's sweeping tariff regime, ruling his use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose broad import taxes was unconstitutional. The decision was a significant check on executive power, emphasizing the limits of presidential authority in economic matters. The November 2025 verdict dismantled a core pillar of Trump's second-term economic policy, which had levied tariffs on nearly all U.S. trading partners. This policy had been a cornerstone of his administration's efforts to protect American industries and jobs. The ruling sent global financial markets into turmoil as investors scrambled to assess the future of American trade policy. The uncertainty led to a sharp decline in stock prices and increased volatility in the markets. The justices sided with businesses and states who argued the president was overstepping, unwinding tariffs that had reshaped global supply chains. Many industries had been significantly impacted by these tariffs, facing increased costs and disrupted operations. This was more than a legal decision, it was a direct challenge to the president's America First agenda, igniting a new confrontation between the White House and the judiciary. The ruling highlighted the ongoing tension between different branches of government. President Trump vowed to press on with his protectionist agenda, promising a Game 2 plan to circumvent the court's decision. He remained defiant, rallying his supporters and pledging to find new ways to implement his policies. The world now watches as this high-stakes battle over American trade policy enters a volatile new phase. The implications of this ruling will be felt globally as nations and markets react to the shifting landscape of U.S. trade relations. To truly grasp the Supreme Court's impact on the nation's economic direction, consider the sheer scale and ambition of the tariffs that were just struck down by the court. Beginning in February 2025, President Trump's administration imposed a sweeping baseline 10% tariff on imports from nearly every country in the world, with even steeper rates specifically targeting major trading partners like China, Canada, and Mexico. Tariffs on Chinese goods skyrocketed, reaching as high as 145% on certain products, while special surcharges hit America's closest neighbors, straining the North American trade bloc and putting decades of economic cooperation at risk. The administration insisted these measures would force fairer trade, protect U.S. industries, and revive American manufacturing. But the reality was that the costs landed squarely on American businesses, who suddenly faced higher import prices and tough decisions: absorb the costs, cut jobs, or pass them on to consumers. By September, the government had collected nearly $90 billion in tariff revenue, a staggering sum that filled federal coffers but came at a price. Critics argued the policy punished American families and businesses far more than foreign governments, driving up prices on everyday goods and fueling inflation. Trump framed the tariffs as a necessary fight for American workers and national pride, but a broad coalition of business leaders, economists, and now the Supreme Court saw them as a blunt, damaging tool that risked long-term harm. The legal defeat marks a dramatic turning point, but the economic pain and political debate unleashed by these tariffs are far from over. The administration's rationale was short-term pain for long-term gain, but the backlash from businesses, consumers, and political opponents was swift and severe. Now, with the Supreme Court's ruling, the nation faces a reckoning with the true costs and consequences of this bold economic experiment, and the path forward remains uncertain. The Supreme Court case was born from the economic distress of businesses and states nationwide, as communities across the country struggled to cope with the fallout from sweeping new tariffs. For many, the sudden changes meant layoffs, shuttered storefronts, and mounting uncertainty about the future. Small and medium-sized companies, hit hardest by the tariffs, argued the president's actions were both economically damaging and legally baseless. Owners described how rising costs and lost customers threatened their survival, and many felt powerless as their livelihoods hung in the balance. 12 states joined, claiming the tariffs hurt local economies, threatened jobs, and usurped Congress's power to regulate commerce. Governors and attorneys general warned that unchecked executive power could set a dangerous precedent for future economic crises. At the heart of the dispute was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977, a law originally designed to give the president tools to respond to foreign threats, not to reshape domestic trade policy. The administration argued the law gave the president broad authority to regulate imports during emergencies, including setting tariffs. They claimed swift action was necessary to protect national interests and respond to global challenges. Challengers countered that the law was never meant to let the president overhaul the entire tariff code. especially since the word tariffs is absent from the statute. They argued that such sweeping changes should require explicit congressional approval. They insisted only Congress can impose taxes on this scale, and the president's interpretation dangerously stretched the law's intent. Lawmakers from both parties voiced concern about the erosion of legislative authority. The Supreme Court was asked to decide, does the president have the power to unilaterally rewrite U.S. trade law, or must Congress remain the ultimate authority on tariffs and taxes? Their answer would not only resolve this case, but also reshape the balance of power in American economic policy for years to come. When the case reached the Supreme Court, justices from both sides of the aisle expressed deep skepticism about the administration's broad reading of the IEPA. The major questions doctrine quickly took center stage. For decisions of vast economic significance, Congress must clearly authorize presidential action. Chief Justice Roberts pressed that overhauling the nation's tariff structure was a major question, and the law's silence on tariffs was telling. Justice Gorsuch warned that unchecked emergency powers could erode Congress's constitutional authority over trade and taxation. Liberal justices questioned why no previous president had used the IEPA to set tariffs in nearly 50 years. The court's unified skepticism signaled a likely defeat for the administration's argument. The stage was set for a decisive ruling that would redefine the limits of executive power. The Supreme Court's verdict was clear. President Trump had exceeded his authority under the IEPA. The majority opinion, led by Chief Justice Roberts, declared that only Congress can levy taxes and duties on such a scale. The court leaned on the major questions doctrine, emphasizing that Congress must speak clearly if it wishes to delegate such monumental power. The absence of tariffs in the law was critical. Congress never intended to hand over its core economic powers through vague language. The ruling warned against blurring the lines between branches of government, reaffirming that Congress sets trade rules, not the president. The decision dismantled the legal foundation of Trump's tariff strategy and reasserted constitutional limits on executive authority. Even in emergencies, the president must operate within the framework set by the nation's founders. The Supreme Court's decision sent shockwaves through global markets, which had adapted to Trump's tariffs. Instead of relief, the sudden policy vacuum triggered intense uncertainty and a broad sell-off. U.S. stock indices tumbled, with the Dow, S&P 500, and NASDAQ all posting sharp declines. CNN's Fear and Greed Index plunged into extreme fear, reflecting widespread panic. International markets followed suit, as currencies and multinational stocks swung wildly. Businesses had spent months and billions adjusting to the tariffs. The court's ruling upended those plans overnight. The abrupt change was seen as just as disruptive as the tariffs themselves. Markets had hoped for a gradual, negotiated rollback, not a legal bombshell that erased the rules in an instant. The fear now this vacuum could be filled by even more unpredictable trade conflict. President Trump's response was swift and defiant. He condemned the ruling as a political attack and vowed to continue his tariff-centric agenda. He announced a Game 2 plan, signaling that the trade war was far from over. The White House made clear it viewed the court's decision as a setback, not a defeat. Experts pointed to other legal avenues the president could use to reimpose tariffs, since the Supreme Court had only struck down his use of the IEPA. The administration's legal team was already preparing to pivot to alternative statutes. For businesses and trading partners, this meant continued instability and uncertainty. The legal battle had become a political struggle over the future of U.S. trade policy. The only certainty: the administration would use every tool available to pursue its agenda. Attention now turns to the alternative legal tools in Trump's arsenal. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows a temporary 15% import surcharge, no investigation required. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act lets the president restrict imports for national security, a power already used on steel and autos. New investigations are underway into sectors like semiconductors and critical minerals, justifying tariffs as security measures. Section 301 of the Trade Act enables tariffs against countries with unfair trade practices, recently used against China and still available. Even the rarely used Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 could allow tariffs up to 50% on discriminatory countries, though it would spark fierce legal and diplomatic battles. The fight over trade policy is far from over. It's simply shifting to new legal battlegrounds. Global economic uncertainty remains the order of the day.